In Switzerland, he's a research fellow of the prestigious international research associations, and he has been awarded diverse research prizes, including the Reinhard Zelten Prize and the Ludwig Erhard Prize, which are very respectable prizes in Germany for academic achievements. He serves as an editor of the academic journal Kiklos, and he publishes regularly on topics to Swiss direct democracy, decentralization, and its link with real estate prices as well. David, I know you speak Dutch, and so this means your native language is German. I guess you speak a bit of French as well. Your Dutch is actually better than many of the prime ministers we used to have. So if you, it's a joke I stole, but over lunch we were debating this. But so if you seek asylum in Belgium, I'm sure there's a great political career for you.
Great.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much for this beautiful introduction. I will still speak English here. So my name is David Stadelmann, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here. And I want to talk about the success story, or about the secret of success, about how you get better politics through decentralization. Let's look at some success stories, and let's compare countries. I've chosen 4 countries here: Switzerland, Germany, France, and Belgium. And I want to compare them according to, well, a few dimensions, economic dimensions, but also other dimensions. For example, I take gross domestic product, so average incomes more or less. And I just check Switzerland versus Belgium, so competition between these 2 countries. When you look at average incomes at GDP per capita, then Switzerland is roughly twice as successful as Belgium and also as France and Germany. Of course, as everybody knows, prices are far higher in Switzerland, but still, taking account of purchasing power, you still earn roughly 30 to 40% more in Switzerland. So Switzerland is top there. If you then look at debts, public debts in percent of GDP, there Switzerland is also top, but top at the bottom. It has only 40% debts of GDP in 2021, whereas the other ones, well, you know, Germany is still roughly okay, but France has actually overtaken Belgium. Well, that's a great success, isn't it? Budget balance, that changes now quickly. But when I checked in July, the planned Swiss budget balance for this year is nil. So no deficit, but also no surplus. They are not that good anymore. They were supposed to make a surplus. But evidently much better than Germany, Belgium, France. Looking at a competitiveness index, usually Switzerland is always at the top, definitely ahead of the other 3 countries. And now you may say, well, this is all economics. Who really cares about economics? We want to be happy. We want to be a happy nation, happy people. Well, okay. Then actually there is life satisfaction that is measured also by economists. And when you look at that, the Swiss are happier than the other 3. Sometimes the Danes tend to be a bit happier than the Swiss. Sometimes the Norwegians are a bit happier than the Swiss. But usually Switzerland internationally is always at the top regarding happiness. So the question is, where does the success come from? What's the secret? What's the innovation? And I argue that it's competition through decentralization. That's one major reason for the success of Switzerland. You all know the small country, and I've brought a beautiful old postcard. So that's Switzerland with the nice things you can see, etc. That's the cantons. And actually, it's fascinating in the sense also that you have many different languages, 4 languages actually. So you have French-speaking regions such as Geneva, Vaud. You have German-speaking regions, Zurich, Zug. You have an Italian-speaking region, the Tessin, very nice. And you have also this small language, Romanche, 40,000 people speak it. So huge heterogeneity. You have heterogeneity regarding religion. There are conservative German-speaking cantons, Catholic, like Luzern, but also you have a Protestant center in Zurich, and you have a Protestant center in Geneva, and a Catholic center in Freiburg, actually, where I studied and worked. You have large differences in income. It's not so that only the French speakers tend to be poor or rich. Sometimes you have also relatively poor cantons in the German-speaking area, that's Graubünden, relatively poor. They are still far richer than all their neighbors. But you have also poorer French-speaking cantons. So huge heterogeneity. And that makes the success, that makes the competition. And actually the map, the postcard that I present you here, if you know the country, it's not correct. Because, well, it's an old postcard, because there are more cantons actually. Cantons separated. New cantons emerged. Now it's 26 cantons. For example, Basel, Ball, is not anymore Basel. It's Basel City and Basel Countryside. Two autonomous cantons. It's Appenzell, very conservative. Appenzell Innerrhoden, Appenzell Ausserrhoden. You have two. Unterwalden doesn't exist anymore that way. It's Obwalden and Nidwalden. And actually, in 1979, the canton of Jura, which didn't exist before, separated from Bern. And just recently, last year, a municipality in the canton of Bern decided, oh no, we want to be French. We want to be Jura. We don't want to belong to the German-speaking canton of Bern anymore. And they changed. No problem. Majority vote? Very fine. So they changed. In 2021, that's Moutier, roughly 10,000 inhabitants. Oh, no great problem. If you look at the decentralization in Switzerland, it's massive. You have 26 cantons now, perhaps in the future some more. They can be very small, like Appenzell Innerrhoden with 16,000 inhabitants. They can be relatively large, like Zurich with 1.5 million inhabitants. They have their own income, business, and wealth taxes, and they set their own tax schedules. It's called a general state tax, where you then have a multiplier, a tax multiplier on it, and they decide on the progressivity as well as on deductions. That works quite well, actually. For the small canton of Appenzell Innerrhoden, no problem at all. There are also 2,148 municipalities, and they are also autonomous. They set their own taxes. They set tax multipliers on the cantonal state tax. A multiplier, you will call it obcentium. So they put the multiplier on the state tax, okay? And of course, they change the multiplier usually every year. They have relatively strong autonomy too. There is the clear principle of subsidiarity enshrined in the Swiss constitution, which is of course also written in French, so I will translate that for you. De cantons oefenen alle rechten die niet door de grondwetten aan de federatie zijn gedelegeerd. That's subsidiarity really. And there are limited vertical and horizontal transfers, so there are some transfers. Roughly 0.7% of GDP is transferred. There is no bailout practiced, though there is no, it's not enshrined in the constitution that there must be no bailout, but it's lived. I will give the example soon. Evidently, all this really leads to a striking extent of decentralization and a striking extent of competition. The cantonal share of total expenditure in Switzerland is roughly 43%. The municipal share is roughly 23%. The cantonal share of tax income is 46%. The municipal share is at roughly 30%. So it's striking. You get, evidently, when you have a system like that, you get competition and you get large differences in total taxation. I will show you immediately. But generally low taxation, as everybody knows. You get evidently too large or relatively large differences in incomes between cantons, but generally high incomes everywhere. Let me show that to you with two examples. So that's a map of Switzerland. Here are the municipalities. and I pick out 2 municipalities that may be known, and I show you the tax burden for married people with 2 children having a gross income of 150,000 Swiss francs. Nowadays, as the situation is relatively stable in the country, that's roughly 155,000 euros. So a decent salary, but not too high. How much taxes do you pay? There are also some health contribution that you need to deduct, but so I only focus on the taxes. In the city of Zurich, it's roughly 4.9% in 2021. Oh, that sounds quite good. But it's far higher, 50% higher roughly in the city of Lausanne than in Zurich. It's 13.5%. So there are differences, yes, but generally taxation is relatively low. Look at net incomes per capita, per taxpayer, excluding actually mandatory health insurance. So health insurance is paid privately, but it's compulsory, so everybody needs to pay it. Canton of Zug, that's the richest and most successful canton, with actually the lowest tax rates too. Average incomes there, net incomes per taxpayer, 135,000 Swiss francs, that's 140,000 euros. A poorer canton is also German-speaking canton of Bern. There it's just net incomes per taxpayer of 75,000. You see, it's not really a language issue. It's competition driving everybody else to better results. And that's the fruitful role of Swiss decentralization. The thing is, it reduces government failure. What do I mean by government failure? By government failure, I mean something very human. Everybody likes it if you can spend the money from somebody else. It's lovely, But of course, it's not good for the system as a whole. Politicians have a huge problem too, one has to understand them. They cannot know what people really want, and of course people have problems controlling politicians. How can I know what people in Lüttich want, Leuke, Liège, or in Antwerp? So I have to have local knowledge. And decentralization reduces the national government failure. There is local government failure, but it's not so bad. How does it work? Well, one thing is decentralization increases, thus fiscal equivalence increases. What's fiscal equivalence? Fiscal equivalence means that the taxpayers are the decision makers, are also the beneficiaries. If you have to pay for your own expenditure, well, then you think twice what you really need. If somebody else, again, is paying for your expenditure, well, then you also think, but you spend a bit more. The responsibility of local decision makers is increased through decentralization. You know who to blame for, I'm pointing now on the former prime minister. The variety of policy solution increases, which means you can compare, and of course, if one municipality or canton is not working so well, you can threat to go somewhere else. Let's change. If taxation in Lausanne is too high, Zurich is also nice. It has also a lake. Why not change? Why not change to Zurich? But importantly, you can learn from each other. What is working well here, you can copy. What's not working so well, so learning is enhanced. I will give you an example soon. And one of the most important things, I think, is there is a public discussion then on whether you spend money, not on how you spend money. That's a large difference, I think. Take the beautiful train station in Antwerp. Perhaps it's necessary to build it like that. But interestingly, then people think, well, we need to spend money also in Liège, Lüttich, for a similar train station. Well, why? Couldn't we just save the money somewhere? So in Switzerland, people think whether public expenditure is really necessary. Evidently, there are challenges of decentralization. One question is, why is there no destructive race to the bottom? Standard theory would say there is a race to the bottom. Everybody goes for extremely low taxes. But that's not what you observe. You get good public services at relatively cheap costs. And the reasons are, I think, that there is some fiscal equalization. There is a relatively progressive federal income tax, and public services really aiming at redistribution are at the federal level. So there is no destructive race to the bottom, but there are low taxes and high incomes. An alternative problem of decentralization, now from the other side, could be, why do municipalities do not run for public debts? You could say, well, if I can move away from my municipality, then I go for debts, and then I simply move away. Who cares? Who cares about the future of the municipality if I live somewhere else? But what you see, that's not the case again in Switzerland. Municipal finances and overall debts are very low. And actually, they all have debt breaks. So debt breaks are institutionalized. The Swiss national debt break came from the cantonal debt breaks. So this is a learning process. And interestingly, the Swiss debt break introduced in 2003 inspired the different debt breaks in European countries. It was learning from Switzerland. And there is an additional argument why municipalities and cantons do not go for excessive debt, because people know that they owe it to ourselves. And I give you this example. I take 3 more minutes. Of course, sometimes there are municipalities with excessive debts, also in Switzerland. That's the case of Locatie. Perhaps you have been there. It's a nice place. It's in Valais. And there are 2,000 people, so you see 2,000 people roughly, they went for 340 million debts. So that can happen. But there was no bailout. Creditors had to get the hit. It was not the Confederation paying, nor the canton paying for the municipality, but the municipality also has to contribute through raising taxes and lowering public services for the next, it started in 1998, so they are having lower services. And that means it's not such an attractive place anymore to live. We owe it to ourselves. My studies on property prices in Switzerland show that communities, municipalities that go for debts, they tend to have lower property prices. Do you want to live in a municipality with very high debts? Oh no, it's not an attractive place. Thus, property prices are lower there because people know they have to contribute to paying back their debts, and that capitalizes negatively in property prices. What can we learn from all this? What are some conclusions? What are some lessons? I think that decentralization is not the success of decentralization is not specific to Switzerland. There is no Swiss culture, Swiss thinking. There are German speakers, there are French speakers, there are a lot of immigrants, etc. It's decentralization. It's nothing specific to Switzerland. Indeed, decentralization in the past worked very well. Greece was a success in the past, over 2,000 years ago, with independent city-states. It's not such a great success anymore as a centralized state. But the success was here, and we learned a lot from Greece. Ik zal het op Nederlands zeggen. Ik geloof dat de Zwitserse decentralisatie een uitvoerproduct is. En jullie zullen het moeten importeren. Maar het is niet genoeg alleen te zeggen dat Vlaanderen fiscale en uitgavenautonomie moet hebben. De gemeenten in Vlaanderen moeten ook autonomie hebben. Dat is belangrijk. Dat is de echte uitvoerproduct uit Zwitserland. En dat wordt vaak vergeten, dat de gemeenten hoeven ook autonomie. Autonomie voor Vlaanderen alleen, maar centralisatie voor de gemeenten is niet genoeg en is ook niet goed. Innovatie, goede politiek, die komt van beneden naar boven. Jullie maken deel uit van innovatie. Succes komt van de mensen beneden. Succes komt van succesvolle gemeenten. En dat zal Wallonië en Vlaanderen wel ook een succes maken. Het alternatief is niet zo mooi. Het alternatief zijn voortdurende transfers. En grote overheidsschulden. Het alternatief is Vlaanderen betaalt. Hè? En dit is niet goed voor Vlaanderen, het is niet goed voor Wallonië, het is niet goed voor de bevolking van België. Daarom echte decentralisatie nu. Bedankt.
Thank you very much for your great presentation in both languages. That's very impressive. We have room for a few questions. Any questions? Yes, go ahead, please.
And in Switzerland, it's my impression there are also cultural differences between the Germanophobes and the Francophones and the Italian phones. But phones and phobes, it's quite different. But in Belgium, moreover, we have also huge differences in collective political preferences. The Flemish people are rather on the right-wing side economically and also culturally, while in Wallonia it's just the opposite. My impression is that Belgium cannot work because you have these two cultural differences and these huge political differences. What is the situation in Switzerland? Are there also differences in political preferences between the Germanophones and the Francophones and the Italian phones, or is this rather homogeneous? And if this would be the case, that could explain that Swiss federalism is working well, while the Belgian one is not working.
So there are large differences, evidently. That's what I wanted to highlight. Not only regarding language, but also regarding religion, regarding immigration, so where do you have a lot of foreigners, etc., and also regarding political preferences. It's called the so-called Rösti-Graben. Huh? People like to eat rösti. That's a kind of potato that is... You know, huh? you had it. And the Röstigraben goes through here, well, between Freiburg and Bern. That's roughly the Röstigraben. Because if you look at referendum decisions, it's often the case that people will say, well, the French-speaking, I don't know if it's a minority, or no, probably a minority, well, it's a minority, they vote differently than the German speakers. But it's not always the case, huh? It affects some questions, but that's precisely the strength why you need decentralization. Huh? Let them do what they think is good, and the others do what they think is good, and then learn from each other. And the French speakers, les Romands, they are very quickly at learning, and knows German-speaking canton wants to be called that it's lagging behind the French-speaking cantons. So you push each other. Huh? So it's this positive aspect of competition. It's not destructive. Huh? It's learning from each other, trying to be better than each other. And of course, all this together means that in the end, you are far better than all your neighboring countries. And that's then the real success.
Yeah, over there.
Thank you very much. The explanation has been very clear, but can you elaborate a bit more? Yeah, okay, sorry. Can you elaborate on the link between the size of your many communities and the success?
I think the size is not that important. So when you look at some economic literature, then you can try to calculate an ideal size for municipalities. That has been done also for Switzerland. And there it comes out, well, the ideal size of municipalities is roughly between 8,000 and 12,000 inhabitants. But if you take that seriously, it would mean that the city of Zurich has to be split up in 40 municipalities. And nobody would say that this is a very good thing. I think it's precisely, again, this difference in size. Let me stress that again. An alternative way, which is also interesting and successful, are the Scandinavian countries. In Denmark, you have 98 municipalities, and you don't have this intermediate level like the cantons. And the system also works well with relatively large municipalities. But it's also a very competitive system in that sense. So it's not the size itself of the municipalities that matters, but whether they can really compete. And you can compete successfully with a small size or with a large size. I didn't mention one element. There is an even more, you should have said, I'm wrong. Because there is one country that is far more successful than Switzerland and which is a Swiss neighbor. It's Liechtenstein. And Liechtenstein has 38,700 inhabitants. And everything, if you have been there, everything is working smoothly. Everything is nice. You could have your dinner on the street, actually, because everything is so clean. It's amazing, and it works with this size. Yes. I need to close, but we can discuss. We can discuss during the pause. Thank you.
I know you're very excited about Liechtenstein and about even the Swiss that are happy with all that money. But actually, research shows that happiness makes you happy. The other thing is a glass of wine makes you happy, and flirting makes you happy. So I'm not sure whether the Swiss are doing that, but they could even be more happy. So I was asked again not to clap hands. You know, I'm an academic, I can do whatever I want, but I will acquiesce. So we cannot applaud anymore, sorry about that, for our next speaker, Jan. But so apparently they heard us clapping upstairs, so we should refrain from that. Our next speaker is Jan Fiedermoek. We go back a long time, 20 years or more, when he was doing research on transition economics as well at the ULB, where he got his PhD. He currently holds the 2020 Chair of Excellence at the Université de Lille. And he is also a faculty associate at Prigo University in Havířov, the Czech Republic. And he was also the founding head and external advisor of the Institute for Strategy and Analysis at the Government Office of the Slovak Republic during 2015 and 2020. Jan has many research interests, including political economy, economic development, and institutional economics. And he has published a ton of journals in the leading academic journals, such as the European Economic Review, European Journal of Political Economy, and I could go on a bit like that. Jan, the floor is yours. 20 minutes, please. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's going to be a difficult act to follow right now, but I'll try to do my best. So I was asked to talk about Czechoslovakia, which is a country that doesn't exist anymore. And I think this is essentially my way in. It's an example of a successful disintegration rather than a disastrous disintegration. And some other examples that we had in recent history worked out much worse. The case of Czechoslovakia shows us what can happen when, rather than inflaming passions and kind of getting angry with each other and trying to punch each other in the face, people sit down at a negotiating table and they agree to disagree in an orderly fashion. And this is essentially what happened in Czechoslovakia. So to give you a very brief introduction, Czechoslovakia was a relatively young country. It was established as a consequence of the First World War, out of the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But the two main parts came from the two separate parts of Austria and Hungary. The former Kingdom of Bohemia, or as people call them, the Czech lands, used to be part of Austria, and they had a long history of being an independent nation, and actually in European environment, quite an important nation. Whereas Slovakia was part of Hungary, essentially without any special status for a long time. Briefly, there was also Transcarpathia, which is now part of Ukraine, which was also part of Czechoslovakia when Czechoslovakia was established as a new country. Now, these regions or these territories were joined together in Czechoslovakia because they were culturally and linguistically close. The language is very similar. A good parallel would be the difference between Danish and Swedish, and I guess nobody can correct me in this audience that I'm wrong. The two languages are closer than Dutch and German. And generally, people don't have a problem understanding each other, but at the same time, if you speak one, people know that you're not speaking the other. So they're sufficiently distinct. Now, initially, there was an idea that the two groups would form a single nation called Czechoslovak nation, and this was essentially a matter of political convenience, because if they would be recognized as separate ethnic groups, then Czechoslovakia would be conceived as a multi-ethnic country, with the first ethnic group being the Czechs, followed by Germans, and only then Slovaks. There were actually more Germans in pre-war Czechoslovakia than Slovaks, and so with Czechs and Slovaks put together, they had something like 2/3 majority in the new country. Now, the history was relatively brief. They were together in the interwar period, one of the few democratic countries in that geographical space. Then they were separated briefly during the war, reunited in 1945 without Transcarpathia because Stalin thought otherwise. And then they became a federation, Czechoslovakia became a communist country shortly after the war. It formally became a federation with some degree of political decentralization in 1969, but it was still under strict communist rule. And then eventually it broke up in 1993, essentially because of a political impasse after the election of 1992. And this is what one of the previous speakers said, sometimes history happens in an unexpected way. It wasn't actually expected at the time that the election in 1992 would lead to the breakup of Czechoslovakia, but it happened to unfold that way. Right, so the competencies of the two republics when they were still together. Formally, Czechoslovakia was a federal state in the sense that there were two constituent republics. There were federal institutions, then there were institutions of the republic. There was a federal parliament, and the two republics had their own parliaments. And importantly, the federal parliament was a bicameral one, where in one of the chambers or the houses, the House of Nations, the two republics had an equal share. And important decisions had to be approved not only in each house, but also in each half of the House of Nations. And this theoretically gave each constituent republic a veto over important decisions. Now, this was put in place by the communists, who expected that this would never be a problem. And it wasn't a problem until democratization in the 1990s. But then it turned out to be an issue in 1992. But essentially, other than that, so it was formally a federation, but all decision-making, all policy-making was highly centralized. Very few decisions were delegated, other than perhaps education, to the level of the republics. And this was quite important. Now, economically, Slovakia was less developed. It was essentially a poor part of Hungary, which itself was a poor part of Austria-Hungary. The Czech lands, on the other hand, were a rich part of Austria, of the Austrian part of the monarchy. It was already, in 1918, it was relatively highly industrialized part of the country, and so there was a big developmental gap. In the interwar period, there was some convergence, but not a lot. Then, when the communists took over, they fueled significantly more convergence by fueling economic development in Slovakia. But that also meant that Slovakia, the industry in Slovakia was oriented eastwards. Essentially, at that time, Czechoslovakia participated in what they called the International Division of Labor within the Eastern Bloc. And so Slovak industry was conceived as being geared towards trading with the Soviet Union and with other Eastern European, Eastern Bloc countries. And this turned out to be quite important as well. To some extent, this development or this convergence was fueled by fiscal transfers, but these were implicit. They were not, so there was no sort of explicit transfer in the federal budget from the federal government to Slovakia. Again, because everything was centralized, the federal government would spend money in one part or in the other, and the best thing that we have is estimates of these transfers, but they were not quantified as such at the time. Some people try to estimate them ex post. So as I said, there was this difference in orientation, and one example of this, one of the, if not the most important company in the Czech Republic at the time of independence was Škoda Auto, which you probably know, which turned out to be quite successful company selling cars. There's a lot of Škodas driving in Belgium and everywhere in Europe. The biggest company in Slovakia was VCZ, which was a steel mill in Košice, which is in eastern Slovakia, close to the border with, back then was the Soviet Union. Essentially, the main reason why it was put there was it was on the railway from the Soviet Union. They were getting iron ore and other raw materials from the Soviet Union, and then they were making steel there. So it was huge conglomerate which was designed to work with Soviet clients. And this turned out to be a problem when the Soviet Union imploded and the trade with the Soviet Union collapsed. And now it's part of US Steel, but it's a much smaller company. Actually, now the biggest Slovak enterprise is Volkswagen, which you probably also know, but it's not an indigenous Slovak company, obviously. Now, why did Czechoslovakia broke up? And again, so it happened in a largely unexpected way, and it happened largely because of economic reasons. In 1990, the country became democratic, but it was also centrally planned command economy, and they started changing this. But the reforms were put in place by the federal government, and essentially with the outcome for the federation as a whole in mind. So if you look at outcome for Czechoslovakia as a whole, they were not too bad. But if you look at the two parts, they were much worse in Slovakia than in the Czech Republic. And so I can show you this. If you look at unemployment, basically communist countries had no unemployment. And in 1991, it went up to something like 12 or 13% in Slovakia, whereas in the Czech Republic, it was something like 4%. And then it stayed reasonably low in the Czech Republic, whereas in Slovakia, it went almost to 20%. So they were asymmetric effects of these reforms. And given that the country was politically decentralized, this affected voting behavior, political decisions in the two countries. And this is essentially what caused the breakup of Czechoslovakia. Now, here we have some estimates of transfers. There were some attempts to mitigate the adverse effects in Slovakia by sending money to help Slovakia. And so you can see that in 1990, the transfers were relatively modest, 1.5% of Slovak GDP. It went up to according to one estimate, to 4.5% 2 years later. Another estimate by the OECD actually says it was as high as 8% of Slovak GDP. Kind of similar to the Catalan case, except there it's Catalonia paying 8% of GDP. But again, didn't quite work. Unemployment stayed high, and this had these political implications. And so when the election in 1992 took place, the political representations elected in the two countries are very different. There were right-of-center conservatives that were elected in the Czech Republic that wanted to continue in the pre-election course. On the other hand, in Slovakia, there was a change in political orientation, and the government was essentially left-wing nationalists or left-wing populists. And then they tried to negotiate. And the problem was, again, because formally it was a federation, they needed to nominate a federal government that needed to receive an approval in both parts, both chambers of the parliament, and also in both halves of the House of Nations. So essentially each part had to approve the government, and they couldn't agree on a government that would receive this approval. Now, in Belgium, this is a more mature democracy, and you're used to not having a government for more than a year. But this was a new democracy at the time where having an impasse for a few months seemed like an unbearable proposition, especially since there was still a lot to do for the federal government. And so when they saw that they couldn't negotiate a compromise, they agreed to disagree, and instead of negotiating how to form a federal government, they started negotiating how to split the country. And this is essentially what happened in 1993. Now, what happened afterwards? Again, this was a negotiated separation, and so they decided to maintain close economic ties. So Czechoslovakia maintained a mini EU single market afterwards. They had a customs union, they had free movement of labor, and they decided to maintain a common currency. And they were successful in keeping this except for the common currency, which lasted only for 6 weeks, largely because it wasn't credible, because there was no common central bank, there was not sufficient commitment at the political level to maintain this, and largely the financial markets didn't believe that the common currency would be maintained in the longer term. And this is based on a paper we wrote a couple years ago, well, a couple decades ago, actually, by now. Right. Now, economically, the breakup was costly, but the costs were essentially largely in the short term. The economic ties suffered between the two countries. And we can see this, this is from the paper that we published. This is what happened with respect to common trade. And there's this discontinuity here because until 1993, the data were based on internal trade, effectively. And then from 1993 onwards, it's international trade. So there's a slight discontinuity, but the two lines are quite close. What we see is there was a decline in trade already before disintegration, and this is what in economics we call trade diversion. This was, Czechoslovakia was oriented towards trading with other Eastern European countries. Once they were not forced to do that, they started reorienting their trade westwards, to trade with Germany and other countries in the West, and including at the expense of trading more with each other. But when the breakup occurred, there was a sharp change in this trend. And this is essentially the cost of the separation, but it's essentially just 1 year. And then you can see the same trend continued as before. So there was a short-term cost, but it wasn't a disaster. And it was something that would have probably happened anyway, but it would have happened more slowly. So some trade between the two countries were lost, but to some extent this was replaced by trade with other countries. Again, the customs union, free mobility of labor were maintained until both countries entered the EU. And so in that respect, it wasn't too bad. They maintained close political ties, in part because of membership in the so-called Visegrad group, together with Poland and Hungary. Without necessarily coordinating, they chose very similar economic paths. So both are now powerhouses for car manufacturing, with Skoda in the Czech Republic, with Volkswagen, Peugeot, Kia, making cars in Slovakia, essentially becoming assembly points for Western foreign car manufacturers. And eventually the convergence continued. So Slovakia is still poorer, but as you can see, the gap became much lower over time. So even without a common state, these countries have been converging together. They closed about half of the gap by mid-2010s, and then it widened a bit more recently. Also, unemployment, which there was a big difference initially, so this is the same graph as before, but both countries lowered their unemployment, and now actually Slovakia is not that much more, doing that much worse than the Czech Republic. And with respect to inflation, in the last 10 years or so, the numbers are almost the same, despite the fact that they have a different currency. Slovakia has the euro, the Czech Republic kept their own currency. So what can Belgium learn out of this? And so, as I've shown you, if this integration happens, there will be costs. It's costly, it leads to disruption of traditional economic ties. But again, this is not only trade destruction, to a large extent it's trade diversion. Rather than firms trading with another firm in the same country, they find a trading partner somewhere else, because that is better for them at that point. And so there is a short-term decline to be expected, but not necessarily a permanent decline. It will be made up by increasing trade with other countries. And we can also see that there was a disruption in the UK-EU trade after Brexit for the same reasons. Now, again, the case of Czechoslovakia shows that when you maintain close economic ties, this disruption need not be very high. And in the case of Belgium, it's even better because this country has delegated a lot of economic policy making to the level of the EU. So if Belgium were to turn into 2 or 3 or more separate countries, I think nobody would expect that Flanders or Wallonia would consider having their own currency. They would continue using the euro. They would want to stay part of the customs union or the single market. And so this disruption, doesn't necessarily have to happen because this is something which is not controlled at the level of Belgium. It's been delegated to the EU level. Now, one thing, again, history happens sometimes in unexpected ways. Actually, no major party, either in the Czech Republic or Slovakia, went to the election promising independence or promising separation. It was an outcome of the political impasse, and especially when you have populists on one side of the table or both sides of the table, it's difficult to predict what will be the outcome of that negotiation. Having said that, the positive result was that this problem with populists essentially became or stopped being a Czechoslovak problem. There are populists in Slovakia, there are populists in the Czech Republic, but it doesn't affect their ties as much as it used to be the case. And so one important potential source of tensions or political problems for these two countries has been removed, essentially by removing the question of what to do about their mutual relationship. And in this respect, that is a positive aspect of this integration. Thank you very much. I'm happy to have your questions.
I cannot help it. People have their own thing. Thank you very much, Jan. I think there's a lot of similarities between Czechoslovakia and the case of Belgium, including two strong leaders on both sides with very opposite views, but it didn't materialize a few years ago when this happened at the negotiation table here. Okay, 1, 2 questions perhaps? Are we all getting tired and in need of a coffee break? It has been 2 hours almost already. We started a bit late. If there's no questions, you can ask. Oh, there's one question. Yeah, go ahead.
Fiscal transfers, there was no transition system of solidarity between Czechia and Slovakia after the separation. Here I understood it well, and that is the case. Nevertheless, we have seen a bigger conversion after several years, so it was a positive thing.
Obviously, from January 1st, 1993, the two countries were fiscally separate. So there were some ongoing divisions of the common property, but for the most part that was divided in the course of 1992. I think the only issues that may have been still settled in 1993 was things like the foreign reserves and the treasury of the central bank, the gold stocks and things like this, which had to be transferred because they were held in Prague. But there was no system for fiscal equalization of fiscal solidarity between these two countries because they became separate countries. Now, there was convergence because essentially both of these countries got their own governments, and these governments were able to put in place policies that reflected the needs of their country. Personally, I think that this is more important than having a purse somewhere where you get money from. You need a good and effective government that puts in place good policies and maintains a good institutional environment. And this will create a favorable environment for economic growth. So you can have economic growth without receiving transfers from someone else. I hope this answers your question.
There's a question here in the front row.
Yes, thank you, Jan. Vincent Verhouden, European Commission, but speaking in a private capacity. You showed some charts which indeed show growth, quite significant, and also convergence. Of course, you would need to probably normally compare with what would have happened otherwise, I guess, if the two had remained one country. Has that been done? Have you done that? Secondly, how do these charts compare with, let's say, other countries in a comparable situation, including Poland, Hungary, and so on? I would be curious to see how that has developed. Thank you.
Okay, this is a really good point. Obviously, we don't know what is the counterfactual for both of these countries. There is an econometric or statistical way of doing this. The problem is in order to create this hypothetical counterfactual for these two countries, you need a lot of data. And you don't have a lot of data for a country that doesn't exist. There are estimates for the Czech Republic and Slovakia, but they usually go a few years, up to a few years before the independence, but you don't have 20 or 30 years worth of data. On top of it, the communist authorities collected data slightly differently, so even for Czechoslovakia as a whole, the data before 1990 is not necessarily comparable with the kind of data that they collected afterwards. So I haven't done it, or we haven't done it with my co-authors, but it would be interesting. I'm not sure whether it's feasible because of the data issue. As far as comparison with Poland, Hungary, and other similar countries are concerned, these two countries are in line with them. So they're both, the Czech Republic within the Visegrad group is the most successful. And then Slovakia may be second or third. But this hierarchy has been pretty stable. They're not necessarily too much out of sync with each other.
Thank you for that question. In fact, Vives has done some research on that using the synthetic control approach. And so there's a book on it. It's not always a bonus. There's sometimes a malus as well of secession or independence, but depending on the conditions. In the case of the Czechoslovakia, if I recall correctly, there was a positive effect with a hypothetical counterfactual. So there is research on it, but it depends very much on the conditions, right? So in this case, there was integration with Europe, trade with Europe, this trade diversion that you mentioned, and that helps a lot, of course, to kind of go the right way. Okay, thank you very much, Jan. We're coming to an end. Our good friend and colleague, Geert